Fishing for walleye can call for a variety of techniques and approaches. This week on Scene Family Outdoors, I'm going to break down the walleye rod and reel combos Ashley and I will use on our upcoming Canada fishing trip. Alright, welcome back to Scene Family Outdoors. This is part 4 of our Canada prep video series as we get ready for our annual summer trip up to T&D-Amisk to target big northern pike. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing to our channel. We'll continue to put out videos for the next several weeks leading up to our trip of all the planning that goes into going to a drive-to fishing lake and all of the lures, the reels, the rods. We'll even get into the food that we pack along the way. So let's get started here. Similar to our pike video last week, I'm going to break down the rod and reels that we use for walleye fishing and talk about some of the choices like what line we use, the weights we use, the rods we select. Maybe to start things off similar to how I did on our pike video last week, when it comes to line selection, I continue to be a proponent of braid for fishing for walleye as well as for northern pike. I just find that the braid, I enjoy the sensitivity that braid has on it. And then some things I'll get into is how I use drag slightly differently with walleye than I do with northern pike. But I continue to like braid as a primary line source. If you're doing a lot of, maybe it's trolling or things like that, you might prefer to have a monofilament setup. I just haven't found a need to have monofilament become a mainstay in my walleye angling setups. So let's dive right into things. Similar to northern pike, I bring 2 walleye setups for both Ashley and I to use. And similar to pike, I have both casting and spinning versions to talk through. Unlike northern pike, when you go from the heavier end of spectrum of lures down to the lighter end that we'll talk about for walleye, spinning gear becomes much more the predominant method used, and casting becomes more of a fringe utilization for gear. I still tend to like casting gear, so I will talk about some casting options that I've had luck with. But we'll inverse it this week, and we'll start off talking about the spinning setups. So this rod is another custom rod that Ashley had built. I'll talk to her combo, the pieces, and then break them down. So to start with, this is the rod. It's a St. Croix SCV5, or SC5, SCV for 5. Medium light, fast action. This is a 6'6" rod. We pair that up with a 2500 Shimano Stratic FL, and then this is spooled with 15-pound Cortland Master Braid. When we go through these choices, I really like this medium light fast powered rod from St. Croix. They have this across their lineup, so this is more of the premium upper end of their rod blanks. We've also used the Icon version, which would be their walleye specific version for this. You can get this in 1-piece or 2-piece, but for me, this rod, if you're going to have one walleye rod for your arsenal, I would go with a rod like this that's in that medium light power, fast action, in either 6'6" or 7 foot. We have another rod just like this that I'll use at times that's a 7 foot length. This one's at 6'6". If you do more vertical jigging, as this kind of an all-rounder, if you do more vertical jigging, you might consider the 6'6". If you're doing more trolling type work, you might consider doing the 7 foot. There's not a huge amount of difference between the rods though. Big fan of this rod because it handles small crankbaits well. You can handle jigs with it well, whether you're vertical jigging or swim jigging, light jigs back to the boat, smaller like X-Wrap jerk baits. It just is a perfect all-around walleye rod, and I'm a big fan of this one for a setup. I would encourage any walleye like angler, if you're looking for a Canada fishing rod, don't know where to start, get that 6'6" or 7 foot medium light fast. From the Icon series at St. Croix all the way up to their Legend Elite, they have that rod in the lineup. When we look at reels, this is the 2500 Stratic. The 2500 is it's like the perfect walleye reel. And unlike northern pike, walleye fishing I think is a bit more straightforward in some of these selections. There's a lot more gear marketed to the walleye angler versus the northern pike has to kind of find the nuances. But we're using these 2500s on spinning setups. I have a Shimano Sustain 2500 that I'll use, but Ashley will be fishing as her primary walleye setup, this 2500 Stratic with 15-pound braid. When we're tying on, and we talk about terminal tackle, we'll typically tie straight to a jig. So if we're fishing for jigs, we'll tie straight to them. But if we're fishing with crankbaits, I will tie on a snap. Not a swivel snap, but just a snap. And I have one set up, and I'm going to get a camera just a little bit closer to it. It's so hard to see from this distance, so I'll zoom in. But the snaps, what they do is we don't have the ball bearing swivel. And crankbaits tend to run a little truer if you just tie them directly onto, just tie a snap on and don't have that swivel part. So this allows us to change out our cranks quickly. You can just tie, I always just tie a double polymer knot for all of my line with braid, even onto snaps like this. I'll tie it onto jigs too. But this is the primary method. 15-pound braid works great. I don't think there's any reason you want to go lighter than 15 pounds. You could consider going to 20 pound. That would be just fine too. But that's going to be our spinning setups for walleye. When we go to casting setups for walleye, and what I'll use for a lot of my light fishing, especially if we're fishing jigs. If we're fishing jigs primarily, I do prefer to use the casting setups. This is a 7-foot medium power, fast action Legend Tournament bass for the rod. I will fish a Shimano Chronarch 50E, so a very small, low profile bait caster. And then I'm putting 20-pound braid, 20-pound Cortland master braid on that reel. So talking through the choices, when it comes to this rod, at the 7-foot Legend Tournament bass rod at medium power, I like this a lot. You don't find a lot of medium light powered casting rods, but when I'm fishing jigs, this one is dang near perfect. It's rated down to a 1/4 ounce on the low end, up to 5/8 of an ounce. I'm usually fishing a 1/4 ounce jig with a trailer, so you're getting to about a 3/8 of an ounce lure, and that is at the lower end for casting with a bait caster. You start to get a little bit of challenge with it, but what I find is that if I'm doing jigs primarily, it's not an issue. Jigs cut through the wind pretty well, and usually I like to position the boat so the wind's always at our backs, and then we'll drift over weed beds. So having the wind at my back usually plays as an advantage. If I am throwing crankbaits though, which is what I use with lightweight setups, I will switch over to a spinning rod, and I'll leave the bait caster at home just because crankbaits are so non-aerodynamic, especially when you get down into that lighter weight like the shallow Shadrap 7s that I talked about in part 2 of our series on lures. So like this rod, we'll use it for jigs. And then with a reel, I'm doing this is a Shimano Chronarch 50. This reel's been out for some time. I think it's been since disconnected, but I like this 50 size bait caster. It becomes really important that you have a lightweight spool when you're fishing these smaller lures so that your bait caster is able to, that spool's able to spin freely, and that light lure will pull the line off. I'll downsize my braid to 20, 30-pound braid, about as narrow as I can get where the bait caster will still handle it, and I've had no issues. I think I may have said 30. This is actually 20-pound braid that I have on this Shimano Chronarch 50. Handles really well. I'll never tie a snap swivel onto this because I'm just using it for jigs on the lighter end. When I go to the spinning rod, I'll put a snap, I'll put that snap on if I'm fishing with crankbaits. So this is the look of what we're going to bring up on our light walleye rods. Again, we got spinning and casting. If you're throwing crankbaits primarily, I leave, especially lightweight crankbaits, I would leave the casting rod at home for the lightweight ones, and I would just go all spinning. So now that we talked through those setups, let's talk about our heavy setups for walleye. Okay, now we're moving into the heavy walleye setups. When I talk heavy walleye setups, we're really looking at, for how we fish, that we're talking big crankbaits. So I want crankbaits that have the capability to dive down to 20 feet. If we use bottom bouncers, we'd use similar setups for bottom bouncers. We're not really fishing planer boards. We're not doing what I call aggressive trolling, like Lake Erie style trolling, but this is more of just techniques on camp boat, hold the rod, and do some maybe less precise trolling when it comes to depth control, but but when you do need to get down deep, these are the rods and reels that we'll use on this approach. I'll talk through both of them. The rods are actually the same blank. The one is just set up for casting gear and one for spinning gear. So again, you can see my maybe proclivity or enjoyment of fishing with casting gear. So let's start in, and I'll kick off again this time with the spinning gear to start. This one is a 7-foot medium heavy power, moderate action rod out of the Legend Tournament Walleye series. We're pairing that up with the Shimano Stratic 2500 FI. So this is the FI version versus the FL version. So several generations older, but this one has been in our stable of reels for some time. Good maintenance, good reel repair, good and reel upkeep. Keeps these fishing for a very, very long time. Big fan of that reel. And that is spooled up with 20-pound Power Pro line this time. And lastly, we'll use those snap swivels, or the snaps without the swivel, every time that we're fishing crankbaits with these. So a little more in depth, you heard moderate action for the first time talking through rods. The moderate action is because we're fishing with crankbaits. And what we mean by moderate and fast actions is that blank is actually going to load up more in the midsection. So a fast action is generally associated with more sensitive applications. And because you're getting that immediate feedback further up the blank. We get moderate, we're actually seeing that blank load up more into the middle section of the blank, and that's very common when fishing crankbaits, especially large crankbaits like that. So that's why we're using this in the moderate action. Medium heavy power, because we are fishing deeper, so we want that rod to be able to not just be completely flexed and loaded while fishing deep. We need to have that capability there. Reels, I already talked about this 2500 Shimano Stratic. In the newer version, same things hold true for it on our trolling setups. Big fan of this reel for trolling setups. Nothing additional to add for that, or the line, or the snaps. Just giving you some insight into what we fish. Next one here, we're going to casting gear. We have really the sister rod to this, Legend Tournament Walleye, 7-foot medium heavy moderate rod. We're pairing that up this time with the Shimano Calcutta Conquest 200 reel. This is spooled with 40-pound braid, and we'll again use that snap as needed for crankbaits. So the sister blanks, these are actually the exact same blank from St. Croix. Using moderate again because we're fishing those crankbaits, medium heavy because we're going deeper. Nothing additional really to add with our rod selection versus what we did with the spinning gear. When it comes to a reel, we're seeing some different things. This reel is actually geared, I think it's at 4.8 to 1, so very slow reel. And we use that slow gear ratio because it gives us more cranking power. So you think we're running lures deeper, we want to have the ability to crank those heavy drag resistant lures back to the boat. I really like casting gear. It's easy to control depth, and then this is spooled with 40-pound Cortland Master braid. Great setup. Right now I actually do have a leader tied onto it, a 12-pound fluorocarbon leader. I've been experimenting with tying leaders directly onto line lately with a uni to uni knot. We're going to make that a game time decision if I leave a tied on leader on or not. I would probably leave a leader on for walleye, primarily for the abrasion resistance is why I'd want that extra fluorocarbon. My line closest to the lure, it would give me some separation from getting caught up on rocks. Or if we would tie into a pike, I'd have a little bit better chance of not getting bit off. 12-pound fluorocarbons, probably not enough to give me the abrasion resistance for a big pike, but it might get me through a pike or smaller pike. If I really wanted to have more pike abrasion resistance, I'd probably cheat up into the 20 to 25-pound leader range. Lastly, I'm going to tie a snap onto that, and we'll be ready to go for our big walleye lures, our big walleye rod and reel setups when we're fishing deep crankbaits. If you liked what content we're putting out so far, please subscribe to the channel. And until next time, get out there and enjoy the outdoors.